You wanted it, you knew I was going to do it, so here it is. With a new Fire Emblem, Fire Emblem spin-off, comes new subtext, and it's only natural that I, as the official gay subtext guy in this fandom, spend an hour or so rambling over the wealth of new offerings available in our second adventure in Fodlan. Thinking about it though, another long video essay just wouldn't do this time. I wanted to have some fun with this topic, because subtext is first and foremost supposed to be fun. So today, we're going to play Which Game Are They Gayer In? The rules are pretty simple. I'm going to take a look at each playable character in 3 houses and 3 hopes and determine which one shows off for them a greater quantity and quality of gay subtext. I'm going to be taking into account everything that I can here. Supports, story events, exploration dialogue, activity dialogue, defeat and death quotes, the whole works. I will be covering every single playable character from these games, even the ones who are only playable in one of them, although the answer for those characters is going to be pretty obvious in most cases. Now, it should go without saying, but I'll say it anyway. These are my opinions, and as is always the case with subtext, most of this comes down to subjective interpretation. I am by no means the only person who's done queer readings of characters from these games, and in some cases, especially when it comes to lesbian subtext, I'm far from the most personally well acquainted with the material. Part of the challenge of this type of whole roster comparison is that I'll have to think about potential queer subtext for all sorts of characters I don't look into very much. I welcome your own interpretations, so if you think I got a character completely wrong, or that I missed something really big, let me know about it in the comments. You could also tell me that 95% of what I'm talking about wasn't meant to be read as romantic or sexual, and that I'm just grasping at straws. But then, I really have to wonder why you'd even watch a video like this. Before we begin, a couple of exclusions. I won't be taking the avatars into account here, because as I've stated in some other videos, these types of analyses get a lot more awkward with a unit whose gender is a literal menu toggle that affects nothing beyond what classes they can access. Take for example this conversation, which looks pretty gay, until you note that female Shez has an identical conversation here, and then step back and realize that the flirty Ashe supports conspicuously involve characters who can S-rank both genders of Byleth in 3 houses. It's just easier to leave the self-inserts aside for this comparison, because even if I did include them, the answer here would obviously be the game in which that character is the avatar. I also won't be including most of these games' bonus characters, because either their presentation is so completely wrapped around the avatar, or they're flat predictable gimmicks and there's just nothing to say about them, or nothing to report, if you will. You could maybe read something into how Shez and Arval always have the same gender, to the effect of their relationship therefore always being a queer one, but as canon does nothing whatsoever with that angle, and in light of my previous comments on avatars, I'm content to leave the partners in Destiny out of this game. There is one notable exception who I will be covering fully, but I'll get to her in time. As for everyone else, they'll be showing up on this chart as I discuss them. You'll see that I have 2 additional categories beyond the ones for each game, although those should be pretty self-explanatory. Place your bets now for which game you think will come out on top. Will it be 3 houses or 3 hopes? I'll be going through the list in alphabetical order, because I've already done a few videos where I use the in-game roster order, and I'm getting bored with it. With all of that out of the way, let's get into it. Not a promising start, sad to say. Alois became somewhat infamous around the time of 3 Houses' release, because he can S-rank both genders of Byleth, but it's one of 2 platonic S-ranks, a first for this series. That disappointment of an ending, and dad jokes, are pretty much this guy in a nutshell. You could say that Alois is the spirit of the game Dream Daddy embodied in a Fire Emblem character. He's got an unnamed and unseen wife and daughter, and his starry-eyed hero worship of Jeralt never gets anything resembling a resolution, even a platonic one, because circumstances conspire to prevent them from ever being playable at the same time, so no support line or activity interactions for them. Alois is straight, because adultery is the one line that intelligence systems isn't willing to cross. The big talking point with Annette is, of course, her relationship with her best friend Mercedes. Notwithstanding how they have a minor argument in Three Houses that lasts for 5 years because the writers weren't thinking about the time skip, theirs is a sweet and companionable dynamic that in their paired ending transitions smoothly to neighborly cohabitation. There's quite a bit of room for interpretation here. Speaking in historical terms, their post-game arrangement sounds like romantic friendship, or more specifically a Boston marriage, wherein two unmarried women live together and they might be just friends or they might be lesbians. No one's really sure. I've also seen people describe Annette and Mercedes as allusions to the Class S genre of Japanese fiction, which I know nothing about, but hey, the Wikipedia article even uses the term romantic friendship. How about that? Looking beyond Mercedes, Annette and Hilda also sleep together in their Three Houses support, and I mean that literally. I've asked women about this scene before, and responses are mixed, with some thinking it's gay and some thinking it isn't. As we'll see, this is a recurring thing with Hilda. Three Hopes doesn't do anything to clear up the ambiguity between Annette and Mercedes, and that in combination with the lack of a paired ending or anything like whatever's going on with Hilda leads me to give the point to Three Houses here. And here we have the Lion's resident cinnamon roll. I usually view twinks as competition, but even I can't find it in myself to hate this guy. Ashe's most consistent source of subtext is Dedue. They get emotional over cooking, Ashe is pretty broken up whenever Dedue disappears during the story, and in Three Hopes they get an expanded array of cute interactions even if their actual support line isn't quite as tenderly intimate. Ashe is just so lovable, though, that he's got other potential boyfriends waiting around every corner. He winds up a cat dad with Caspar, has a second round of bonding over food with Raphael, gets Yuri a little hot and bothered as they bond over their shared past, becomes Sylvain's most eager pupil in what has to be the most on-brand roleplay opportunity possible in these games, and he also has a Cyril support and paired ending that you'd be forgiven for forgetting about. Yep, Ashe is very well situated when it comes to intimate relationships with other men, as befits one of the great gay polycule of Fargus. It's hard for me to decide which game stands out fully over the other, but I think that Three Hopes' larger array of options and more rounded showing for the Ashe-Dew dynamic earn it the point. If I were giving out a reward for the most disappointing subtext turnout in Three Hopes, I'd go with Balthus, hands down. He talks up his man-crush on Holst so hard in Three Houses, but they spend half their support line worrying about Hilda not opening up to her brother. Balthus has a recurring fascination with wrestling Dimitri in Three Houses that even carries over into Three Hopes' exploration dialogue. But guess which house leader he supports this time? If you guessed Edelgard, you win. Nothing but some painful flirting and a strangely on-point Hubert imitation. Were the developers worried that there was no way a support between Dimitri and Balthus could end except horizontally? Balthus honors Yuri with a bizarre term of endearment, and claims that this designation is even more important to him than women, and yet come Three Hopes and there's decidedly less to their dynamic short of Balthus getting in touch with his not-so-inner stripper. Thanks in large part to his quote-unquote bash bro, the hetero-flexible king of grappling scores a point for Three Houses. Bernadetta is a bit of an anomaly among the Black Eagles. Fandom has dubbed them the Gay House, and yet you'll notice that Bernadetta is absent from the standard arrangement of Gay Eagles pairings. Part of this is simply which ships are most popular, but it's also true that Bernadetta just doesn't have a lot to pull from on that front. She's got an A support with Edelgard that leads into a paired ending, although it's not all that noteworthy in the grand scheme of things, and Three Hopes doesn't do much to augment this in spite of a handful of new support lines with women, and also this one scene where Bernadetta makes an O-face with Hapi, because she ate some carnivorous plants. It makes sense in context, I think. With other female characters, I'd be willing to admit that this is not my area, and that there's really a ton of stuff to read into. But as even fandom doesn't care all that much about shipping Bernadetta with other women, I'm confident in sidelining her here as well. There's an odd running gag with Caspar, lightly present in Three Houses but more noticeable in Three Hopes, that he somehow doesn't know what sex is. This understandably presents as much an obstacle to subtext as it does Dorothea's playful attempts at incest roleplay. This even holds true for Caspar's relationship with Linhardt, which from the days of Three Houses pre-release was pegged as a visual callback to arguably the biggest gay pairing in pre-Awakening Fire Emblem, that of Ike and Soren. Unfortunately, however, that comparison is pretty superficial, as their supports and other interactions don't exactly earn them the elopement ending that they wind up with, although it too alludes back to Ike and Soren. Three Hopes doesn't do much to rectify this issue, nor does it offer the now root-locked Caspar anything on the side in the vein of his Ashe support in Houses. It's got Balthus being disappointing yet again, for whatever that's worth. Even with a handful of sweet moments here and there with Linhardt in Hopes, I feel like the first game has a bit more to offer with Caspar on that front. If you're looking for a single counter-argument against the idea that all these characters are straight unless Avatar S-ranks say otherwise, Catherine's a strong contender. She makes no secret of her love for Rhea, and in case you're thinking that's merely a knightly devotion kind of love, she compares her feelings for Rhea to her growing feelings for Shamir in their support line, and their relationship has all sorts of queer subtext markers all over it, including the repeated use of the loaded euphemism partner. Shamir knows what Catherine's about even in the route where they're fighting on opposite sides. In addition to the paired ending with Shamir, Catherine also has a solo ending with Rhea that's effectively a paired ending. Catherine may not be able to S-rank female Byleth, but there's no question that she loves women. Three Hopes cuts back on her screen time, but not at all on the sapphic material. She and Shamir are just as close as ever, and she compares her devotion to Rhea to Dedue's love for Dimitri, which, yeah, hashtag gay lesbian solidarity right there. The level of quality subtext and occasionally just flat-out text with Catherine is about the same in each game, but I have to give the nod to Three Houses for its greater quantity of material. Alright, this one's gonna be a hot take. I know that fandom really wants Claude to be bi, and I get it. Honestly, I do. He's a main character, he's attractive, and he's got the versatility to be anything from a fun, upside-down meme lord to the leader with the most unique backstory and perspective, and a progressive plan for Fodlan's future, to someone who can be used to bash whichever of the other leads you hate. Fandom has done a lot with Claude, even when canon hasn't been very forthcoming, and that certainly applies to putting him in relationships with other men, because the subtext just isn't there. His lore and supports and interactions in both games are numerous, but also strictly political. His supports with other men are all non-starters, and you can count the number of one-on-one interactions he has with Dimitri on one hand. I've got no choice but to say that, in terms of what's actually in the canon of these two games, Claude is straight. If I wanted to put a positive spin here, I'd say that Claude is an example of the limitations of subtext, that fans can often go above and beyond what canon gives to them, and that some people prefer the greater degree of freedom and originality as opposed to the kinds of analytical close reads that I've been doing in this video. And while that's not typically my thing, as long as you're not using fanon to attack fans of other characters or ships, that's not a problem. But yeah, subtextually speaking, Claude's straight. Sorry. The Ashe and Wolves stand out from most of the other characters in that they have more supports and other interactions in Three Hopes, and are generally better integrated into the story. While as we've seen with Balthus, that doesn't necessarily translate to more and better subtext, it can help. Constance doesn't really have much in the way of sapphic content, although I suppose you could read a bit into her Mercedes supports and ending and come to a similar conclusion as with Ancedes. Or is it Mercenette? You get the idea. It's easy to see, though, that the most important woman in Constance's life is her fellow wolf, Hapi, with whom she shares a quirky, odd couple dynamic befitting of their respective character gimmicks. I'd say that Three Hopes takes the connection a little further, as their recruitment situation in two of the routes calls attention to them as a pair, while their support and interactions are as odd and oddly sweet as in Three Houses. I'm giving the point here to Three Hopes. Oh, Cyril, the mimetic loser of this roster. Everyone, including the developers of Three Hopes apparently, forgets that he exists, and even when people remember him, it's generally not all that fondly. Perhaps on account of his age relative to most of the rest of the cast, or because of his status as a relatively unimportant non-student character, there's just not that much to pull even from his Three Houses supports. As I said before, Cyril does have a paired ending with Ashe, but you'd really have to try to see anything deeper in it. He's going in the straight category. What can I even say about these two that I haven't said already? Not much, honestly, so I'll let the two of them speak for themselves.
He tends to keep to himself, but he possesses one of the kindest hearts of anyone I know. I'm proud to call him my vassal.
His Highness has said that he trusts you, and I have no cause for doubt. But if you mistreat him in any way, I will take action. I believe in you, but please ensure that His Highness survives as well. Fodlan's future would be in peril if we lost him. I would not be able to go on.
Dedue? Of course. And in exchange, I ask that you swear something to me here and now. Do not ever throw your life away again. Understood? Fall back, Dedue! Please, I cannot afford to lose you!
I would sooner fight to the end, but that would bring great pain to His Majesty.
These past 9 years, I am proud to have been at your side. It was a joy I never could have hoped for. Despite all, I count myself a lucky man. Is that so? I see. I am glad. I used to summon you to my room under the pretense of keeping you safe from the others in the castle. And then I'd have you listen to me babble until sleep finally claimed me. And if I told you to forget me and live for your own happiness?
I would regretfully decline. I cannot know happiness without you by my side.
But had I been born to a different fate, well, perhaps I would have traveled outside Fodlan with you as a mercenary. Or perhaps I'd be a farmer. I confess the thought does sound rather delightful. Listen, Dedue, perhaps you consider me to be someone special, but I think the same of you. You are irreplaceable, cherished. So stop saying that we cannot be friends. Stop saying such awful things.
Please, do not look at me that way. You promised me you would build a kingdom that is proud to boast of Duscur blood. In this kingdom, where there is no distinction between the people of Duscur and the people of Fodlan, will I finally, without reservation, be able to call you my friend? Will I, Dimitri?
Dedue. Yes, you will call me your friend again and again, no matter how many hardships I must endure. Let us go together, with you by my side. You shall never taste defeat.
And that's just Dimidue. We've already talked about Dedue's bond with Ashe, and trust me, we're gonna get to Felix. And even on top of that, there's other odds and ends that put all together make Dimitri and Dedue some of the most subtextually queer men in these games, especially with the avatars and their artificial player stand-in privileges taken out of the equation. But how could I even choose the Dimidue content in just one of these games? Three Hopes only added to the substantial amount of intimate moments and heartwarming insights into their relationship, and topped it off with them finishing each other's sentences in a partner special and some tender cinematic hand-holding as they firmly grip a phallic object. These two remain the heart of the great gay polycule of Fargus, who in the others have returned to their own homes and beds and boyfriends, are living together in the castle raising like 12 adopted children, and then getting buried together because everyone in Fodlan could see that Dedue was a royal consort in everything but name. There's just so much to enjoy in both Three Houses and Three Hopes that I could never choose one over the other. Here we jump from two characters with heavy subtext but no avatar endorsement of their queerness to nearly the opposite. A character who's both openly bisexual and gets an S rank with female Byleth to quote-unquote prove it. Some might wonder if there's even a point to looking at Dorothea's other relationships when she's got that S rank in her back pocket, but to that I say that it's in looking at her other supports and interactions that we can see the different ways in which Dorothea engages in relationships with other women compared to with men, a nuance that's notably lost with a gender variable self-insert. There's a lot to choose from here too. She and Petra have their share of flirtatious moments in both games, and their paired ending sees Dorothea try her hand at the gay royal consort gig. She and Manuela have their shared love of the stage and history as Middle Franc opera divas, and their support line ends with the two of them giving up on men and choosing to live with and for each other instead. There are other relationships too that are harder for me to parse, namely Ingrid in Three Houses and Hilda in Three Hopes. Put a pin in both of those though, because since we know Dorothea's into women, I'd rather tackle them from the perspective of the other characters. Then there's Edelgard, and despite some casual flirtations, as well as the knowledge that they're both bi for Byleth, I find their dynamic extremely difficult to pin down. As for the chart, I'm going to give Three Houses the point for Dorothea, because once again there's just more content in that game. But now, let's talk about some of the problems with romantic readings of Edelthea, among other pairings. How do you even have a conversation like this about a character who from her original concept was designed to be both enemy and love interest to an avatar? Edeleth is practically the spine of both of these games, even down to the soundtrack, and Edelgard's fixation on the player as Byleth supersedes all of her other relationships, even with the other avatar. This is a far cry from this, emotionally speaking. It's little wonder, then, that even Edelgard's relationships with men that you'd normally expect to get a lot of ship tease, like Hubert and Dimitri, are themselves essentially relegated to subtext, no more in your face about potential romance than any of her significant interactions with women. We just talked about how that affects Dorothea, and it affects Monica in Three Hopes all the more because Monica is so upfront about her love for Edelgard, and Edelgard just never makes it very clear how she feels about that. Probably the most significant bit of subtext for Edelgard, in my opinion, is one that fandom overlooks, namely her support with Manuela. They get a little flirty near the end, and this leads into the two of them remaining unmarried and growing close in their later years, a type of ending between two women that we've already seen a few times. I was tempted to give Three Houses the point here for Manuela alone, but I realized I'd probably get angry comments if I didn't at least acknowledge that Edelgard indulges Monica, I guess? That's hardly a promising description for a relationship, but it's about the best anyone can do when they're going up against Edelgard's beloved teacher. Felix is a character with a lot of layers, including his queer subtext, and while I've never been the best at appreciating those myself, I can't help but be aware of how much there is to dig into with him. Three Houses makes it evident that, despite Felix's usual prickliness, Dimitri is extremely important to him to a degree that he's not all that eager to admit. The Demilix dynamic is unusual in that its more suggestive moments in Three Houses are less in their support line, which is about working through Felix's complicated anger and grief, and more in bits like exploration dialogue, and other interactions that hint at how close they used to be and how much Felix still cares about Dimitri deep down. This doesn't carry over into Three Hopes, however, where Felix stands out as one of only a few characters who get more story focus in a game where they're root-locked. Houses does mine the potential for Felix to leave Dimitri to some extent, both in exploration dialogue on other routes, and in Felix being the only character whose end cards change substantially depending on the route. But the trade-off in hopes is that now Felix gets to stand beside Dimitri just as strongly as Dedue always has. And he even gets major character moments with Dimitri that he's denied in houses because of Byleth. They still have some issues to work through in their support line, but their rapport is more companionable in this game, and their second conversation even ends with a suggestive fade to black while Felix hauls Dimitri to bed. The bit about being there with Dedue is important as well, because Hopes explores their relationship further beyond the open hostility they display in houses, with a shared paralogue and a support that breaks the usual rules to deliver some serious thruple energy. Dedue and Felix may not love each other exactly, but they come to respect each other and understand how important they both are to Dimitri. To think, though, all this time, and I haven't even mentioned Sylvain, Sylvix is the most popular gay male pairing in this fandom, and looking at their content, it's not that hard to understand why. Felix and Sylvain have what I consider to be a more typical shippy dynamic compared to Felix and Dimitri, with the ever-popular bickering tension that betrays how much they both care about each other but are embarrassed to admit it. That's not to say that the Sylvix subtext is weaker than that of Dimilix, but rather that it's more straightforward and never exactly plot-relevant. If anything, it was the combination of Dimilix and Sylvix that first got me to thinking that the Lion's Boy subtext doesn't really follow the standard motions of love triangles, nor does each one exist in isolation like various Eagles pairings, but rather they're reflective of what we know of the culture of Fargus and how it lends itself to all these men loving and caring about each other so strongly that it's hard not to see it all as more than a little bit gay, even if that wasn't the writer's intention. I'll be returning to that topic a little later, I think, but for now, Felix's point goes to 3 Hopes. All that extra story content is just too enticing to put him anywhere else. From one contrarian number 3 to another, Ferdinand is similar to Felix in a number of ways, most obviously in how each of them goes from having one of 2 distinct arcs in 3 houses to a single root-locked one in 3 Hopes. Unlike with Felix, however, Ferdinand's subtext is all but exclusively tied to one other character, unless you really want to read into his asking Linhardt to paint him or something. No, this analysis all comes down to the 2 jewels of Adrestia, or twin jewels depending on which game you're playing. And even then, there are effectively 3 separate flavors to Ferdinand's relationship with Hubert. There's first their supports and ending from 3 houses, what might be called Pride and Prejudice Ferdinand from its delightful tea dates and delicate blushing over compliments delivered via letter. Next comes their relationship in houses outside Crimson Flower, what might be called Wicked Ferdinand in a reference that shippers will immediately recognize. Here, the 2 find themselves on opposite sides of a war, but still have a vaguely defined connection that kind of sounds like they had a furtive tryst off-screen at some point. Who can say if they've been changed for the better, indeed. Oh, and this is also where Ferdinand laments finding something else to fill his huge hole. Will I ever get tired of that joke? No. No, I will not. Last, but certainly not least, is 3 Hopes Ferdinand, which fandom hasn't yet affiliated with another piece of media, but which deserves attention all the same. As I said in my Scarlet Blaze overview, I appreciate that Ferdinand gets his own subplot, and that Hubert plays such a large role in it, although I have mixed feelings about the epithet from their 3 houses ending being used as a battle strategy of all things. It doesn't match the otherwise serious tone of most of their interactions in Hopes, and it only reminds me of how much of Ferdinand's campy side gets left out of this game in favor of this more somber reckoning with his father. While personally I prefer what we see of Ferdinand in 3 houses, I can't deny the draw of all that story content, especially as it underscores the inability of the Eagles trio to function as a unit in the same way as Dimitri and his 2 closest boyfriends. I'd say the game's just about break even when it comes to Ferdinand. As with Cyril, Flayn's perceived age gets in the way of most potential romantic interactions, although it sure doesn't stop Linhardt proposing sex for science. The only non-Avatar women Flayn can support across both games are the fabulously bisexual Mittelfront divas, and even with them there's nothing there. Flayn appears to be straight, although give her a few hundred years and who knows. Here's another easy one. As we established with Alois, Intelligent Systems isn't down with adultery for some strange reason, despite everything else Fire Emblem characters can get up to, so Gilbert is written around his strained relationship with his daughter, and also theoretically his off-screen wife. There's also his devotion to his late king and later on Dimitri, but even under the most liberal interpretation of Fargus's deeply homosocial culture of knighthood, Gilbert, or rather Gustav, trails behind even Sylvain's father, much less all the rest. S-rank with male byleth or not, this guy is straight. Funny that Hanneman comes right after Gilbert, because their support lines contain just about the only instance of what could generously be called gay subtext for either of them. Apart from that, Hanneman's tastes run toward contrary divas as well as his female students, to the point that he can end up paired with 5 of them. I will delicately decline to comment on that, but as is also the case with Gilbert, the demotion from playable status in 3 Hopes doesn't help either, and Hanneman winds up in the same category as a result. In the interest of not repeating myself too much, what there is of sapphic material involving Hapi is pretty much all tied to Constance. There is this moment where Shamir proposes a trip to Dagda together that you could maybe read into given Shamir's own inclinations, but really it all comes down to Hapi and her Coco. Not surprisingly, she's counting for 3 Hopes for the same reasons as Constance. The game just loves pairing them up, both on the battlefield and off. As someone who's done my best to give equal time to the women of these games, Hilda frustrates me to no end. She's got a plethora of chummy interactions with other female characters, and for the life of me, I can never tell whether they're the sort of thing that might be called suggestive, or whether they're just gals being pals. We've already seen 2 of those interactions, namely the bed sharing with Annette, and her gushing over Dorothea's marketing prowess, and there's also her eagerness to craft a perfect scent for Leonie. The only one of these that fandom has taken much notice of, though, is her friendship with Marianne, which apparently became popular enough for IS to give them a summer duo unit in Heroes, and a paralogue to themselves in 3 Hopes. Hilda may very well be the least heterosexual member of the Golden Deer, although as we'll see, that's not exactly a high bar to clear. It's hard to decide where to place her, however. Houses may give her a paired ending with Marianne, but Hope seems a bit more self-aware of how ambiguous Hilda's behavior can come off. I'll split the difference and put her in the middle. Oh, Holst, we had such high hopes for you. 3 Houses talks him up as this grand, imposing figure of a man, stunning enough to stir even the stubbornly heterosexual hearts of the men of Leicester. Come 3 Hopes, and Holst certainly lives up to his reputation as a beast on the battlefield, but as a character he's sadly quite flat. The prime suspect for this oversight is a lack of supports, and in the few that he does have, Holst's preoccupation with his sister overrides everything else. Fire Emblem does indeed have a lengthy tradition of sibling incest subtext as well, but that's not what I'm looking at in this video. For our purposes, let's mark Holst down as straight and move on. Not unlike his flamboyant foil, Hubert's gay subtext is of the exclusive variety, bar some amusingly dirty wordplay with Linhardt. Everything I said about Ferdinand when talking about Ferdinand applies here as well, so rather than rehashing all that again, I'd like to take this opportunity to remark that Hubert's bisexuality is refreshingly not tied in any way to the menu toggle that is Byleth's gender. His attraction to Edelgard is one of his major motivations, and that's all the more apparent in 3 Hopes, where he's thrown into a kind of rivalry for Edelgard's attention with Monica and her even more obvious affections. This attraction naturally comes into play in Hubert's relationships with other women, and it inevitably makes its appearance in his oddly effective seduction of Ferdinand as well. As a side effect of his one-sided rivalry with her, Ferdinand essentially wants to be Edelgard. That's gotta come up in the bedroom with these two at some point, right? Three Hopes, unfortunately, has less screen time to spare for Hubert, even if he is serving up some major "your son calls me daddy too" vibes in this one cutscene. He plays a supporting role in Ferdinand's subplot in Scarlet Blaze, and has to contend with Monica moving in on his usual position at Edelgard's side. And the other two roots sideline him later on in their stories to the point that people have speculated that he and Ferdinand are dead in the second half of Azure Gleam. This is never actually confirmed, by the way, and I have my headcanons about the two of them going off and being melodramatic and evil together, but the fact remains that Hubert's diminished story presence cuts down on his interactions with Ferdinand outside their more somber supports. For that reason, I'm giving a point to Three Houses for him. Ignatz perpetrates what is possibly the most blatant instance of no homo in Three Houses outside of certain Avatar S ranks. His supports with his best friend Raphael aren't the most exciting in the world, but they have a few cute moments here and there. And then, in their ending, Ignatz marries Raphael's never-seen sister. That about sets the tone for his interactions across both games, and not even being named a Knight of House Gloucester in Three Hopes generates anything promising. Nobody makes knights like they do in Fargus, huh? Ignatz is straight, although I do have to give him props for recognizing the erotic potential of religious artwork. As a particularly irreverent Catholic myself, I wholeheartedly approve. When people are looking for knee-jerk reasons to hate Ingrid, typically they'll call her a racist. However, in the early days of Three Houses fandom, it was also sometimes observed that she is the only student character to not have even a single same-sex paired ending. Granted that doesn't necessarily mean all that much, as we've seen with characters like Bernadetta and Ignatz, but it still stuck out as conspicuous. Not helping matters is her support line with Dorothea, which has sparked repeated arguments about whether this is Ingrid repressing some bisexual feelings, or whether Dorothea is overstepping and violating Ingrid's boundaries. I will politely refrain from stepping in on that debate, although I will remark that their paralogue almost seems as though it was written for two different characters entirely, as their dynamic in this scene more resembles Dorothea's mildly flirty interactions with other women. Three Hopes doesn't do much to weigh in on the topic of Ingrid's sexuality either. She gets an A support with fellow Byleth-endorsed bisexual Mercedes, but their rapport is more of a sisterly one, and not in a kinky way. I'm going to err on the side of caution and place Ingrid under Three Houses, solely for the possibility that there might be something in that paralogue scene. Still, there is something funny about how much the Knights of Fargus are predisposed toward men, even in the one instance where the knight in question isn't also a man. Oh look, another married man with no subtext to speak of. What a surprise. Jeralt's technically a little different from the others, as he's a widower, but he's still so in love with Citri that even Manuela fails to turn his head. Let's stick him with the other dads and move on. Am I feeling up for starting some controversy? Why not? Jeritza is straight. I know what you're thinking right now, but hear me out. Jeritza has no supports or other interactions with male characters apart from the two avatars, and although he does have an S rank with Byleth, it fails to convince me that Jeritza really understands what sex is, much less if his desire to have Byleth kill him could be even remotely construed as romantic unless you're really into hybristophilia. Their ending has nothing whatsoever in it about romance, and although their S rank gets Jeritza pondering love, he's also doing it while he and Byleth are in the middle of killing a bunch of Agarthans. I have every confidence that Jeritza will have a very weird but very satisfying orgasm when he and Byleth finally fight to the death, and that he won't be picky about their gender when he does, but I greatly hesitate to classify that as actual bisexuality. The representational value of Avatar S ranks really does fall apart the longer you look at them. I can't quite put my finger on why, but if Hilda is the least heterosexual of the deer, Leonie is possibly the most. Despite the usual array of supports, there's just nothing to talk about here, and what little there is Leonie being uncomfortable at her scent intermingling with Hilda's, and her confusion when Shamir all but states that she'd previously been in a relationship with another woman. Leonie and Shamir do in fact have a paired ending in Three Houses, but it's nothing to write home about. She seems to be, for our purposes, entirely straight. Linhardt's popped up a few times in this video already, although more often on account of how his blunt way with words can lead into some eyebrow-raising comedic bits. Curious, though, that even though Linhardt is bi for Byleth, this bluntness is never directed at other men. Not even Caspar, really. While I sorted Caspar with the Three Houses crowd, I'm tempted to stick Linhardt in with Three Hopes instead, as that game provides those amusing Hubert and Ferdinand supports I mentioned earlier, as well as a paralogue for Linhardt and Caspar to share that, while still not what I'd call romantic, still gives them another opportunity for some affectionate bickering. It also illustrates that, as is maybe also the case with the Lions boys, the Caspar dynamic may run in the family. Three Hopes it is for Linhardt. Lorenz and Ferdinand may be two foppish birds of a feather, but they're leagues apart in the subtext game. I think the biggest factor is that Lorenz just doesn't have anyone to play off in the way that Ferdinand plays off Hubert. The interactions between the men of the Alliance are all quite heterosexual, even with Holst and Balthus factored in, and Lorenz doesn't have any connections with other male characters that might give him something more entertaining to work with. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Claude, but unfortunately their conversations and even their paired ending are strictly political. I'm stunned that the developers thought that these two merited a unique CG in their Three Hopes support line, a privilege enjoyed only by Edelgard and Dimitri otherwise. I get that Lorenz is an appealing option for reading Claude as bi, for narrative proximity if nothing else, but this is a pairing that rests on fanon rather than any meaningful subtext. At least they can hang out on the chart together. As we've seen, there are certain groups of characters that seem predetermined to have almost nothing in the way of subtext. Dads are one of those groups, and we can include Lysithea in a second category for characters like Cyril and Flayn, whose perceived ages make their writing less likely to get flirty. They aren't completely devoid of romance options. Lysithea, for example, can marry Balthus despite an 11-year age gap, because that's just how Fire Emblem rolls sometimes. But the romance they do have tends to be explicit, and therefore heterosexual. You could, at a stretch, make a case for Lysithea's relationship with Edelgard, which gets expanded upon somewhat in Three Hopes via a shared paralogue. But we've already talked about why Edelgard's relationship writing is pretty flat all around, and that certainly applies here as well. Lysithea, like several of the Golden Deer before her, ends up in the straight group. Manuela's such a fun character, a messy, melodramatic diva barely holding her life together but still enjoying herself along the way. It's an absolute shame that she gets such little focus in both games, although Three Houses puts in a better showing for her with a solid array of supports and paired endings, and even a small story role that would have been more entertaining if it had ever gotten a proper resolution. No, her supporting Jeritza in an alternate continuity doesn't count. I've already discussed her relationships with Dorothea and Edelgard, and I like that Three Hopes nods to her flirtatious rapport with the latter as a potential explanation for why she's locked to Scarlet Blaze. I like much less the root lock itself, however, as that combined with Manuela not being a student leaves her with all of 3 support lines. Wow. Not even a paralogue full of admiring generics is enough to make up for that, so into the Three Houses group she goes. This shouldn't be a shock at this point, but like most of the Golden Deer, there's not much to say about Marianne when it comes to queer subtext. In her case, she's so timid and soft-spoken most of the time that intimate declarations are basically out of the question, sort of like Bernadetta, minus the shrill screaming. And hey, look at that, the two of them get a support line in Three Hopes. Marianne's most noteworthy relationship, though, is of course her one with Hilda, as they get a solid support line in each game, a paired ending in Houses, and a paralogue in Hopes that constantly reaffirms the strength of their bond. Even though it's still fairly ambiguous if there's anything more than friendship to these two, I'd say that overall Three Hopes does more with the pair, so it gets a point for Marianne. See, I knew I was going to run into this issue as I got toward the end of the roster. I pretty much covered all the major same-sex relationships in both games by now, so it's a struggle to avoid repetition. Everything that might be said about Mercedes has already been brought up, leaving only the question of where to place her. On the one hand, Three Houses has the usual full support lines and paired endings, in this case with Annette, and maybe also Constance if you squint. On the other hand, I do appreciate that Mercedes' support with Annette in Three Hopes sees the two of them lay out how they like to spend their lives together, effectively maintaining the spirit of their paired ending even in the absence of any endings at all. Hopes also features a paralogue with Mercedes and her two closest friends, although there's not terribly much to say about that one. As with Annette, I'm going to have to give this one to Three Houses, for a greater quantity of content, if for no other reason. Well, no need for debate over which game is stronger here, at least. Monica's dead and body snatched before you even meet her in Three Houses, whereas over in Three Hopes, her defining personality trait is her exuberant attraction to women, mostly Edelgard, but also Dorothea to a lesser extent. I have issues with how frequently that attraction is used as a punchline, as it reminds me of how Awakening handles Frederick's excessive devotion to Crom, which is not a flattering comparison by any means, and is a far cry from how these games frame Catherine's equally explicit love for Rhea, or Dedue's for Dimitri. And then you start to think about how Monica is the closest thing to an exclusively same-sex attracted character in these two games, and yeah. I think you can understand why I'm not a fan. Let's just keep going. Now here's a point of contrast. Observe how Dorothea reacts to Monica fangirling over her, and now here's how she reacts to Petra calling her precious. Even with the running gag of Petra struggling to express herself, her feelings for Dorothea are always taken seriously, and indeed lead into what sounds very much like a marriage proposal. Three Hopes continues in this vein, and even sees the pair protecting each other from a group of thieves. Dorothea and Petra have a surprisingly rounded dynamic for two characters with no pre-existing history and minimal story focus, and I can appreciate their paired ending for going a step beyond many of the other paired endings between women that stop short of having them cohabitate or anything else more definitive. On the basis of that ending alone, I'm placing Petra under Three Houses. It's fitting that Raphael is the last of the Golden Deer I'll be talking about, because far more than any of the others, he managed to surprise me in the transition between games. In Three Houses, it's business as usual with Raphael. His supports with Ignatz are sweet until their ending friend-zones them hard. There's nothing doing with Claude and Lorenz save for some predictable comedic bits, and not even Dimitri can wring anything eyebrow-raising out of the guy. Come Three Hopes, however, and Raphael's prospects with other men improve a great deal. Not with any of the other deer, mind you, but rather with Ashe, who gets a support line with Raphael that plays out like a more comic version of the Ashe Dedue supports from Houses. Raphael is indeed good at drawing out comedy, lowbrow and otherwise, and on that note, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention his Felix supports, which are not particularly noteworthy, but for a sequence where Raphael's confusion over Felix's favorite nickname leads to some entertaining innuendo about fisting Dimitri. Felix does have a brawling boon in Houses. Anyway though, while still not all that serious, Raphael finds his footing among some of the Lions boys in Hopes, and so scores a point for that game. He also takes the award for biggest gay glow-up of the deer. Not that there was much competition. At long last, we come to the only bonus character to merit a discussion here, as unlike the rest, Rhea has an identifiable relationship with someone who isn't an avatar. Granted that that's still not terribly easy to talk about, as even in the game where she's playable, Rhea lacks many of the interactions that other units enjoy, and both games are extremely sparing when it comes to her overall screen time, far more so than you'd expect of a character who's supposed to be crucial to the story. We're left to extrapolate the degree to which Rhea reciprocates Catherine's feelings from relatively minor details, namely their quasi-paired ending in houses, and the two of them sharing unique partner special dialogue in hopes, something Rhea otherwise only has with other Nabatean characters. That's indeed very minimal in the way of subtext, and there's little to comment on even in their few moments of one-on-one interaction in the story, but it does still highlight that Rhea's bisexuality extends beyond Byleth. Of these scraps of information, I think that the ending where Rhea and Catherine go into retirement together is by far the most noteworthy, so into the Three Houses category Rhea goes. Rejoice, for the streak of boring dads is finally broken. Rodrigue racks up eyebrow-raising moments even in Three Houses where he's an NPC, but unsurprisingly it's in Three Hopes where his role in the broader intimacy of Fargus knighthood really shines through. You really get a sense of how important Lambert was to Rodrigue, and how his grief over Lambert's death and desire to carry on his legacy have shaped his actions in the present. And yeah, this is all pretty gay, even though I'm fully aware that this is an unintentional side effect of the writers not bothering to think about Rodrigue's off-screen wife for more than a line or two. Hell, even Matthias gets in on the action with a death quote that makes me think that Dimitri is not the first king of Fargus to open his heart and his bed to more than one man. While that's a bit more of a stretch than I'd normally like, there is something to be said for how this queer reading of the Kingdom Men puts a positive spin on the writer's laziness. That even though wives and mothers are a rare sight in all of Fodlan, the importance that the men of Fargus place on each other is enough to resonate on its own, and is suggestive of the type of culture that could indeed produce a great gay polycule. So well done, Rodrigue. You've more than earned a point for Three Hopes. But sadly, the last dad in the roster is merely more of the same. Sedeth stands out a little from the others in that he's open to a second romance long after the death of his wife, but he's not exactly looking for love any place that's relevant to this video. He joins all the others, bar Rodrigue. Now here's an interesting case. A few days before the release of Three Hopes, I came across an article online claiming that the game had outed Shamir as being explicitly queer, referencing this scene from her paralogue with Leonie where she alludes to a previous relationship with a female employer. There's also this exchange in her Balthus support, which uses her attraction to women for a joke where, unlike with a certain other character, her attraction is not the punchline, it's that Balthus is predictable. However, I don't really think we needed Hopes to spell this out, when Three Houses leaves little room for interpretation in the significance of Shamir's relationship with Catherine. The intimacy between the two also carries over into Hopes, and it's even implied to be something of an open secret, seeing as Hubert exploits Shamir's concern for Catherine to get her to join the Empire in Scarlet Blaze. For a character who's all about avoiding attachments because bad things can happen if you get too close to people, that's saying a lot. And not just that Hubert has his finger on the pulse of all the strategically relevant lesbianism in Fodlan. As mentioned earlier, you could perhaps read something into her proposition to Hapi as well, but even without that, I believe that Three Hopes is the more standout game for Shamir. Once again, the alphabetical ordering works out perfectly, because Sylvain is in one sense a natural follow-up to Shamir, that being that some have also claimed that Three Hopes confirms his bisexuality. In his case, it comes from Yuri outright asking him on a date, and Sylvain responding that he's into it. Again, while I certainly appreciate this exchange, it's not exactly a grand revelation. Sylvain's support with Flayn in Three Houses implies just as much, and his homo-romantically tinged relationship with Felix has been a fan favorite ever since that game released. Hopes only amplifies what's always been there, giving Sylvain and Felix a second round of unusually tender supports, in addition to letting Sylvain get a little flirty with Yuri, and, even more surprisingly, Ashe as well. Noteworthy, too, is a certain undercurrent to Sylvain's flirtations with men. While I can't comment on the original scripts myself, others have noted that in the Japanese script of Houses, Ingrid accuses Sylvain of having once hit on a man in a dress, which the localization changed to a scarecrow. The spirit of this line actually got carried over into Hopes in the aforementioned Yuri support, where Sylvain initially mistook him for a girl. I imagine that opinions on the tastefulness of these lines will vary, but as someone who's had sexual partners who are into cross-dressing, I think it's kinda cool. The implied physical preference is a degree of insight into Sylvain's sexuality and even potential kinks that no other character in the game really has. Like, it's very obvious that Hubert would like Edelgard to step on him, but you have to dip into headcanon to imagine Ferdinand happily slipping into full imperial regalia so Hubert can indulge in a very different sort of bootlicking. Back to Sylvain, however. I'd say that Three Hopes, expanding the scope and depth of his bisexuality while also building on the existing Sylvix content from Houses, lands him in with the second game. Alright then, only one character left. And what an ending! I don't have to make a case for Yuri, and I don't just mean that he's bi for Bila. The writing surrounding Yuri's same-sex attraction is arguably more explicit than that of any other character, and that extends beyond the self-insert to include his oddball dynamic with Balthus, his quiet affection for Ashe, and, as we just talked about, his open propositioning of Sylvain. And don't get me wrong, I like Yuri, and even find him relatable in some respects, including his sexual history, but it's difficult for me to overlook that Yuri is queer with a capital Q. He wears makeup, he gets mistaken for a girl, it's implied he was a sex worker, he had a sugar daddy to pay his academy tuition. His attraction to men is so public that a hyper-masculine and ostensibly straight man will jokingly offer his body as enticement. He's the leader of an underground community that considers itself a safe haven for outsiders. As much as some fans like to complain about Niles from Fire Emblem Fates being an offensive stereotype of a bisexual man, you could say many of the same things about Yuri as you could about Niles, even down to their both being thieves and murderers. I'd also point out that, among male Bilet's same-sex S-rank options, Yuri's is the only one to be conventionally romantic, as the others are all either strictly platonic or else have their feelings framed in less romantic terms, be they scientific experimentation or violent murder. If there's a lesson to take away here, it's another reason to appreciate the continued value of queer subtext. Yuri's queerness is fully endorsed by self-insert romance mechanics, in part because he, like Niles before him, fits into what a presumed homophobic audience would expect a queer man to look and act like. And even though I like Yuri's presentation and how much the writing is willing to explore his sexuality and treat it seriously at virtually all points, I find myself spending a lot more time with these games talking about the Lions Boys, and Ferdinand and so forth, because those characters being queer may all rest on ambiguous subtext, but they're a lot more diverse, and many of them represent male character types that don't typically see that kind of development. As for Yuri, I'd say that Hopes overall offers him a more rounded array of options than Houses, which only really has him becoming bash bros with Balthus. If you count his Dimitri supports, this guy has 3 separate inroads into the Great Gay Polycule, where I'm sure he'd fit in quite nicely. Alright, I am done. 43 characters sorted. It was very close, but in the end, Three Hopes edged out Three Houses by a matter of a single character. Of course you could slide any of the characters in the middle one way or the other, but at least by the standards of this highly subjective metric, Three Hopes is, by a slim margin, the gayer of the two games. I wasn't expecting that, to be honest. Houses has the advantage of a more robust support system and paired endings, but when Hopes hits, it hits hard, and it earned itself the win here. Naturally, I expect that everyone watching this has at least one placement that they disagree with, and I'd be happy to read about those in the comments. Thank you all so much for watching, and thanks especially to my patrons for helping to keep me motivated through a rather hectic and busy month. If you like the video, be sure to leave a like and also subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'm still a ways off from 500 subs, but I'd love to hit that benchmark as I plan out even more content for you guys. I'm not sure I have much more to say about Three Hopes at this point, but potential DLC in the future could change that. And until then, I'm always on the lookout for video ideas for Fire Emblem, as well as other games that strike my fancy. So like, subscribe, share your gay subtext thoughts in the comments, and I will talk to you guys later. Au revoir.